Welcome to our presentation on Theo van Leeuwen's Language of Color. We will not be following the book structure, but instead pick up his most important concept along with the different chapters. Before we get into that, however, here's the structure. We'll give you an introduction first, talking about Van Leeuwen's main issues and questions. After that, we'll get into the tools of semiotics of color, followed by the semiotics, metafunctions and systems and schemes of color. The last part will be the conclusion, so a bit of a summary and answers to his first questions. Van Leeuwen's main interest in this study is the social science of color. Although natural science may come in whenever it is necessary, for example, the way color was created. Another interest of his was how color is created and used to project and reflect light, and how color can be manipulated to express feelings, ideas, and how it interacts socially. Van Leeuwen's main thesis can be found on page 4. We compiled it a bit. He mainly says semiotics, as I hope this book will show, can develop ideas about color descriptions that may help answer Wittgenstein's questions about semiotics of color, but also the creation of new colors. He talks about the 3 dimensions or tools of social semiotics. There is a study of semiotic resources. What kind of colors have been created? How have they been used for social communication and expression? The color blue, for example, was very expensive to make and was thus a color associated with nobility and wealth. Another one is the study of semiotic practices, asking how people could use color in specific contexts, why and how they are propagated and justified. The color yellow, for example, was used as identification for monks in the Middle Ages. The third tool is the study of semiotic change, new ways of thinking about color and its uses, and actively influencing color practices. For example, as the procedure of creating color became cheaper, society's interest changed and printing technology advanced. If we think about color and the identity, then we are looking at how color can give information about, for example, social standing in terms of traditional dress, where different colors inform others of demographic details, age, gender, place of domicile, profession, etc., which creates the social identity. He also talks about normative discourses that indicate that, for example, the same colors can have different meanings depending on context, and that the meanings do not usually emerge naturally, but are subject to normative discourses within societies to make meaning explicit. First, there is authority. It imposes norms for colors, use, and meaning without really giving good reasons. Second is expertise. It is usually advice and discourse on color theory and meaning from people who have extended knowledge or experience in the field of color theory. And last, we have the role models, where the best practice example communicates the norms. For example, celebrities setting trends in fashion, lifestyle, etc. Role models are becoming one of the more dominant in normative discourses. In identity functions, color meaning has become a more global medium. People, regardless of socio-cultural context, can identify with the same color meanings. Another important term is textuality. Texts in modern press and mass media are no longer monochromatic, which is black and white. They are multicolored and textured, as well as multimedial. The structure of texts in magazines, websites, and other modern media is now often signaled, not by means of words, but by means of layout, color, and typography. For example, color can have specific textual functions, backgrounds, headings, copies. Instead of marking textual elements verbally, they are marked visually. Meanings of color always depend on subjectivity and socio-cultural context. We ask, what do people say and do with color? People connect color with adjectives, feelings, etc. For example, black was associated with severity and seriousness, death and misadventure, sin and dishonesty, elegance, modernity, etc. Or white as well was associated with innocence, purity, death, sickness, and so on. Color is a social phenomenon. There is not one language of color, rather a multitude of codes. Color is the shattering of unity. Thus, it is through color, or colors, that the subject escapes its alienation with a code, representational, ideological, symbolic, and so forth, that it, as a conscious subject, accepts. Furthermore, the significance of color has shifted from coloring in to having intrinsic meaning to individual identities. Colors can be attributed, for example, the color of his arm, and the meaning of color can change drastically over time. In symbolism, the meaning of color is created with the relation between a carrier, which is the meaning, for example, a medieval knight, and a symbolic color, red for an evil knight, green for an overconfident young knight, and so on. Color played a key role in identifying people in the Middle Ages. For naturalism, the most beautiful colors are those of nature. From Renaissance on, naturalistic modality became the dominant criterion. High modality can be used to lend apparent credibility to something which is in fact not true, and vice versa. For example, fairy tales that are depicted very realistically, while something real like the Holocaust can be made unreal. There's also affect and effect. Color is primarily affective. Color can express character, innate color preferences, etc. Goethe suggested that color is affective. He connects color to an emotional state of mind, and thus in the Romantic era, people linked to colors of affect subjective and individual emotions and character traits. For example, yellow is bright, serene, softly exciting, etc. Color can have involuntary effects. It can influence how we feel. In a blue room, for example, we may feel calm or cold. The color blue may also make a room seem bigger. Red, on the other hand, can make us feel warm, angry, and can make the room feel smaller. Another topic related to meanings are names of color. There is a difference between color naming and color perception. This often stems from color perception in different cultures. There is a distinction between the hue, saturation, and brightness. Not every person perceives color the same way. This also depends on the color surrounding, the position of the sun, etc. Color naming generally relates to people's experience of the natural and cultural world they live in. Names often work with associations, for example, the Spanish white or China white, and naming systems are often based on luminosity, luster, texture, and materialities and history of paint. In chapter 5, Van Leeuwen explains in a first step that color meaning can be approached from psychology, meaning that it is near instinctive, emotive, expressing personality, cognitive, and affecting behavior. But in contemporary context, that is no longer the entire truth. Meanings also depend on context, cultural and historical references, which are usually more semiotically flexible. Still, both color psychology and preference exist side by side. Cultural and historical references of color are usually easier to change since they usually mean that consumers are free to choose references they make through color. We need to consider the materiality of color to be able to encompass all aspects around color theory. All aspects of color need to be considered. Thus, the material characteristics of color have to be interpreted in their meaning potential, which will then add more specific meaning within a context. Also, the meaning potential of color schemes must be considered. Now, Sarah will continue with color acts and metafunctions.
In his first chapter, Van Leeuwen also introduces the concept of color acts and the metafunctions of color. Color acts in that it has an impact on humans, so the fact that certain colors excite, calm, or inspire people's behavior. He also identifies the three metafunctions of color. The ideational function constructs our representations of the world, so in maps, roads, and signs, and how color plays a role in all of these. The interpersonal function is what happens in communicative interactions for social purposes and relations, so adding color to texts to catch attention and emphasize important points. And the textual function will arrange single acts into larger wholes, weaving or composing a text from fragments, so color can code groups and elements as well as distinguish parts. After this, he doesn't take up color acts and metafunctions until chapter 6, where he shows how color meaning and function have developed over time. It seems like he gives the reader a little lesson in the history of art, but focused on color theory. In the Middle Ages, vibrant colors like gold, blue, red, and other gemstone-like colors were seen in manuscript illustrations and illuminations, as well as effects such as iridescence and transparency, which could be seen in stained glass windows, for example. All of these colors dominated art and architecture. The Renaissance returned to more muted palettes that emulated nature, which is also evident in these paintings. And these paintings try to be as close as likeness to nature as possible. Color theory also became a lot more scientific, and the semiotic dimension took more of a backseat. The 19th century took another step into muted colors by using a lot of monochromed themes. Van Leuven even goes as far as referring to that era as the monochromatic age. After such a monochrome period, Impressionism brought more vibrant and luminous color back and used both naturalistic colors as well as non-representational ones to express both emotions and subjectivity. De Stijl and Bauhaus moved further along into deconceptualization by taking the step from art to design. This also reduced art in both form and color schemes, so it was usually more geometric shapes and primary colors that artists would use. You can see this in all types of designs, both pictures, architecture, facades, but also furniture pieces. Lastly, the 90s moved on from these primary colors and minimal shapes and found a lot more interest in color materiality, such as luster and luminosity. Architects would still rely on minimal and simple design, but would add in pops of color to accentuate parts of a structure, especially with light. The last concept that Van Leuven explains is color systems and schemes. He starts by differentiating between medium and mode in chapter 3. While medium is based on the type of material, mode is rather based on informal or formal rules within a system. After this, he moves on to describe how color theory developed from primary, secondary, and mixed colors along the criteria of saturation, dimension, and additive or subtractive mixing. To further understand color theory, one needs to also understand the materiality of color, so how luminosity, luster, iridescence, transparency, temperature, and texture play a role in color creation and interpretation. He also emphasizes the importance of color harmony in the combination of more than one color. Colors will interact and affect each other, as well as create dimensional effects when combined correctly. In chapter 5, he takes up the same elements of color theory as we discussed before, talking about color as bundles of features. But he names the criteria and materiality of color, key parameters of color, and explains that they are not binary, but rather on scales, which allows for a lot more nuanced analyses of color and more precise interpretations of their meanings. He closes this chapter by also coming back to color combinations and schemes, saying that colors always are surrounded by other colors, which will affect their meaning and interpretation. Color schemes can identify various cultural and historical elements, and they do not always have to be harmonious to be effective. Contrasts can also convey meaning potential. He also emphasizes that the key parameters of color aren't always at play simultaneously or with equal importance, but that the parameters are very helpful tools for the analysis and interpretation of color meanings. In the conclusion of Chapter 7, Leuven summarizes and underlines the most important findings of his color language study. He makes two main points. One, that the role and meaning of color has changed drastically throughout history, therefore consisting of various languages of color and heavily dependent on context in every case. And two, that the language of color is defined by two contrasting theories: the theory of color form, which is scientific, and the theory of color meaning, which is psychological. Even though these two theories clash, one needs to include both when looking at the meaning of color. We hope that this presentation helped you understand Van Leuven's text a bit better, and we wish you much success in your ARL exams.